In early 1943, Allied intelligence officers looked at aerial reconnaissance photos of the island of New Britain, just north of New Guinea. What they saw made their blood run cold. In the center of a volcanic caldera lay Simpson Harbor. It was vast, deep, and protected from the open sea, and it was absolutely choking with Japanese steel. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines were packed into the bay like sardines. On the surrounding shores, 5 massive airfields had been carved out of the jungle, hosting hundreds of Zero fighters and Betty bombers. This was Rabaul. The Japanese called it their South Pacific headquarters. The Americans called it the Gibraltar of the Pacific. It was not just a base. It was a city of war. Since seizing it from the Australians in 1942, the Empire of Japan had transformed this tropical paradise into the most heavily fortified position on the face of the earth. By 1943, Rabaul was home to nearly 110,000 Japanese personnel. To put that in perspective, the force that defended Iwo Jima, a battle that traumatized the U.S. Marine Corps, was only 21,000 men. Rabaul was 5 times larger. It was a fortress that could swallow entire American armies whole. General Hitoshi Imamura, the commander of the Japanese 8th Area Army, was a brilliant and pragmatic leader. He knew the Americans would eventually come. He knew they would bring their battleships and their heavy bombers. So he did something unprecedented. He moved the fortress underground. Realizing that the volcanic soil was soft and easy to dig, the Japanese engineers began a construction project of pharaonic proportions. They didn't just dig foxholes. They built a subterranean civilization. Over 350 miles, nearly 600 kilometers, of tunnels were bored into the volcanic rock. These weren't just dirt holes. They were reinforced concrete bunkers. Inside this underground labyrinth, there were hospitals with operating theaters, barracks for thousands of men, ammunition factories, repair shops for aircraft engines, and warehouses filled with enough rice and canned food to feed the army for years. A Japanese soldier could eat, sleep, work, and pray without ever seeing the sun. Above ground, Rabaul bristled with hundreds of anti-aircraft guns. It was a porcupine of steel. For the Allied commanders, General Douglas MacArthur and Admiral William Bull Halsey, Rabaul was the ultimate nightmare. It sat at the center of the strategic map like a venomous spider. From Rabaul, Japanese bombers could strike Allied convoys anywhere in the Solomons. From Rabaul, the Imperial Navy could launch raids against Australia. The conventional military wisdom of the time dictated that to win the war, you had to destroy the enemy's main force. That meant an amphibious invasion. Planners in Washington and Brisbane began to crunch the numbers. They looked at the beaches of New Britain. They looked at the topographical maps. They estimated the casualty rates based on the bloody lessons of Guadalcanal and Tarawa. The projections were horrifying. To take Rabaul by force would require a landing force of perhaps 300,000 men. It would require the entire U.S. Pacific Fleet. The estimated casualties were staggering. Tens of thousands of dead Americans, hundreds of thousands of wounded. It would be the bloodiest battle in human history, potentially dwarfing D-Day in Europe. And the Japanese were ready. They wanted the Americans to land. They had sighted their artillery on the beaches. They had hidden their tanks in the jungle. They were waiting for the decisive battle where they could crush the American spirit under a mountain of bodies. General Imamura sat in his underground command bunker, confident in his defenses. He believed that Rabaul was the rock upon which the American offensive would break. He believed that no army could bypass such a massive concentration of power. He was right about the strength of his fortress, but he was wrong about the American plan. As 1943 drew to a close, the Allies stared at the map, looking at the Gibraltar of the Pacific, and asked a question that would change the nature of warfare forever. What if we don't fight them? What if we just leave them there? By the summer of 1943, the Allied commanders faced a wall. Rabaul was too strong to break. But General Douglas MacArthur and Admiral William Bull Halsey were about to rewrite the rulebook of warfare. They realized that the Pacific War was unique. In Europe, if you wanted to get to Berlin, you had to defeat the German armies in France first. You couldn't just walk past them. They would attack your rear. But the Pacific was different. It was an ocean. If an island garrison has no ships and no planes, it cannot move. It is stranded. It becomes a static prisoner on a rock. From this realization, a new strategy was born. The press called it island hopping. The military called it leapfrogging. But the concept was brutally simple. Hit 'em where they ain't. The plan to neutralize Rabaul was codenamed Operation Cartwheel. It was a masterclass in geometry. Instead of attacking the center of the spiderweb, the Allies would tear down the strands holding it up. The first move was a stroke of genius. General MacArthur didn't land on Rabaul. He landed on the unpopulated coast of New Britain, far away from the Japanese guns. At the same time, Admiral Halsey struck the island of Bougainville. The Japanese commander at Rabaul, General Imamura, was confused. He had 110,000 men ready to repel an invasion. He had artillery zeroed in on the beaches of Rabaul. But the Americans weren't coming to Rabaul. They were setting up shop next door. On Bougainville, the U.S. Navy Seabees, construction battalions, performed a miracle. In the middle of a malaria-infested swamp, they cleared the jungle and laid down steel landing mats. Within weeks, they had built a fully functioning bomber airfield. Now, the Americans were within fighter range of Rabaul. They could escort their bombers, drop their payloads on the Japanese fortress, and return home for lunch. Next came the Admiralty Islands to the north. General MacArthur personally oversaw the capture of Manus Island. The Japanese had neglected it, thinking it wasn't vital. They were wrong. Manus had Seadler Harbor, a massive natural anchorage big enough to hold the entire U.S. fleet. By taking Manus, the Americans effectively slammed the back door of Rabaul shut. The noose was complete. For the Japanese pilots in Rabaul, life became a daily hell. American P-38 Lightnings and F-4U Corsairs swept the skies, shooting down anything that took off. American bombers cratered the runways every afternoon. General Imamura watched helplessly as his unsinkable aircraft carrier was dismantled piece by piece. He had thousands of troops, but they couldn't swim to the American ships. He had tanks, but they couldn't drive across the ocean. The American strategy shifted the nature of the war from conquest to strangulation. Admiral Nimitz famously described the goal: to let them wither on the vine. It was a cruel, slow suffocation. The Japanese supply ships stopped coming. The submarines stopped visiting. The mail stopped arriving. Inside the tunnels of Rabaul, the 100,000-man army began to realize the terrifying truth. They were not going to die in a glorious banzai charge. They were not going to take 10 Americans with them. They were going to sit there, impotent and forgotten, while the war moved past them toward Tokyo. The leapfrog strategy saved hundreds of thousands of American lives. It proved that you didn't need to destroy the enemy's strength to win. You just had to make his strength irrelevant. As the U.S. Navy sailed past Rabaul in massive columns, heading north, the Japanese garrison could only watch from their shoreline. They were arguably the strongest army base in the Pacific, and they were completely useless. The Americans had simply decided not to play their game. By February 1944, the American island-hopping campaign had isolated Rabaul. But to the north, a darker, more mysterious threat loomed: Truk Lagoon. If Rabaul was the Japanese Army's fortress, Truk was the Japanese Navy's sanctuary. Located in the Caroline Islands, it was a massive coral atoll that created a perfect natural harbor. For decades, it had been a forbidden zone. No Western eyes had seen it. Intelligence reports called it the Gibraltar of the Pacific, but the pilots whispered a different name: the Invincible Rock. It was the forward base of the Imperial Combined Fleet. The giants of the ocean, the super battleships Yamato and Musashi, anchored here. It was a nexus of supply, repair, and air power that projected Japanese dominance across the Central Pacific. General MacArthur wanted to invade it. But Admiral Spruance, commanding the U.S. Fifth Fleet, had a different idea. He remembered the lesson of Pearl Harbor. You don't need to conquer a harbor to destroy it. The operation was codenamed Hailstone. On February 17, 1944, the Japanese defenders at Truk woke up to a low hum on the horizon. They scanned the skies, expecting perhaps a reconnaissance plane. What they saw instead was the shadow of death. 5 massive U.S. aircraft carriers had positioned themselves just over the horizon. In a display of overwhelming industrial power, they launched nearly 600 aircraft in a single morning. The Japanese were caught completely off guard. Their radar had failed. Their pilots were still drinking tea or sleeping. As the first wave of F-6F Hellcats swept over the airfields, the slaughter began. It was a reverse Pearl Harbor. American fighters caught the Japanese planes on the runways, taxiing for takeoff. In the first hour, the pride of the Japanese Air Force was turned into burning scrap metal. Over 270 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. Most of them never even got off the ground. With the skies cleared, the bombers arrived. Dive bombers and torpedo planes descended on the lagoon like birds of prey. The water churned with explosions. While the great battleships had fled just days before, warned by intelligence, the support fleet was trapped. Merchant ships, oil tankers, ammunition ships, and destroyers frantically tried to escape the bowl of the lagoon. There was nowhere to run. The scene inside Truk Lagoon was apocalyptic. The Ikoku Maru, an armed merchant cruiser, was hit by a bomb that ignited its ammunition hold. The explosion was so massive it engulfed the American plane that dropped the bomb. The ship vaporized instantly. For 2 days and 1 night, the Americans pounded the atoll. They didn't land a single Marine. They didn't risk a single landing craft. They simply rained fire from the sky. By the time the smoke cleared on February 18th, Truk Lagoon had been transformed from a fortress into a graveyard. More than 40 Japanese ships lay at the bottom of the ocean. 200,000 tons of shipping, vital supplies that Japan desperately needed, were gone. The Gibraltar of the Pacific was now just a collection of burning wrecks and oil slicks. The psychological impact was devastating. The Japanese Navy had lost its safe haven. They were forced to retreat thousands of miles back to their home islands. And then, the Americans did the most insulting thing of all. They left. Admiral Spruance looked at the burning ruin of Truk and decided it wasn't worth the blood of an invasion. It was useless now. A base with no ships and no planes is just an island. The U.S. Navy simply turned their ships around and sailed past it, continuing their march toward Tokyo. The thousands of Japanese survivors on Truk were left alive, stranded on their invincible rock, watching the American fleet disappear over the horizon, never to return. They were no longer soldiers in a war. They were castaways. For the Japanese soldier, death was expected. It was welcomed. The code of Bushido taught that to die for the emperor was the ultimate honor. To charge into machine gun fire, to perish in a banzai attack, was the blooming of the cherry blossom. A beautiful, fleeting end. But the Americans denied them this death. By late 1944, the Pacific War had moved thousands of miles to the north, towards the Philippines and Okinawa. But behind the American front lines, hundreds of thousands of Japanese troops were still alive. They were sitting on Rabaul, on Truk, on Bougainville, and on a dozen other bypassed islands. They waited for the invasion. They sharpened their bayonets. They polished their boots. They scanned the horizon every morning for the silhouette of the American fleet. But the ships never came. Instead, something far more terrifying settled over the islands. Silence. The American strategy of leapfrogging had created a strange, cruel paradox. These islands were now prisons. There were no bars, no fences, and no guards. The walls of this prison were the Pacific Ocean itself. The Japanese soldier was trapped in a prison without walls. The first thing to vanish was the food. The U.S. Navy submarines had strangled the supply lines. The Tokyo Express, The destroyers that used to bring rice and ammunition stopped running. The convoys were sunk before they even left harbor. On Rabaul, General Imamura, the commander of the 100,000-man garrison, was a realist. He saw the writing on the wall. He issued an order that was humiliating for an imperial army officer, but necessary for survival. Drop your rifles and pick up hoes. The elite warriors of the emperor, men trained to conquer nations, were turned into farmers. The jungle airfields, once the pride of the Air Force, were tilled into soil. Between the bomb craters on the runways, they planted sweet potatoes, tapioca, and eggplants. They fished the lagoons not for sport, but to keep from starving. One Japanese diary from the time reads, "We are no longer soldiers. We are castaways. The Americans do not fight us with bullets. They fight us with time. We are rotting away." Disease became the new enemy. Malaria, dysentery, and fungal infections ran rampant. Medicine supplies had run out months ago. Surgeons operated without anesthesia. Men died not from shrapnel, but from infected mosquito bites. On the island of Wewak, the situation was even grimmer. The Japanese army there, the 18th Army, was reduced to eating snakes, lizards, and eventually the bark of trees. Cannibalism, the darkest taboo, began to whisper through the starving ranks in the most desperate outposts. But the psychological torture was worse than the hunger. The Japanese soldier had been indoctrinated to believe that the Americans were soft cowards. Yet, these cowards had done something devastatingly clever. They had deemed the Japanese soldier irrelevant. To be hated is one thing, to be ignored is another. Every day, high-altitude American bombers would fly over Rabaul on their way to bomb targets further north. They wouldn't even open their bomb bay doors. They treated the massive Japanese fortress as a navigation waypoint, nothing more. The Japanese anti-aircraft gunners, for the Japanese soldier, death was expected. It was welcomed. The code of Bushido taught that to die for the emperor was the ultimate honor. To charge into machine gun fire, to perish in a banzai attack, was the blooming of the cherry blossom. A beautiful, fleeting end. But the Americans denied them this death. By late 1944, the Pacific War had moved thousands of miles to the north, towards the Philippines and Okinawa. But behind the American front lines, hundreds of thousands of Japanese troops were still alive. They were sitting on Rabaul, on Truk, on Bougainville, and on a dozen other bypassed islands. They waited for the invasion. They sharpened their bayonets. They polished their boots. They scanned the horizon every morning for the silhouette of the American fleet. But the ships never came. Instead, something far more terrifying settled over the islands. On September 6, 1945, nearly a month after the atomic bombs fell on Japan, a small launch cut through the waters of Simpson Harbor in Rabaul. It carried General Hitoshi Imamura, the commander of the Japanese 8th Area Army. He was heading towards the British aircraft carrier HMS Glory to formally surrender. As Imamura climbed onto the flight deck, the Allied officers waiting for him expected to see a broken man leading a broken army. They had seen the starving, skeletal survivors of other battles like Guadalcanal and Buna. They assumed Rabaul was a graveyard of disease and despair. What they found instead shocked them to their core. General Imamura stood tall. His uniform was pressed. His sword was polished. And behind him, on the island, stood an army that was not only alive but terrifyingly intact. When Australian and American troops finally went ashore to occupy the fortress they had bypassed for 2 years, they realized the magnitude of the bullet they had dodged. They didn't find a skeleton crew. They found nearly 100,000 fully equipped, disciplined troops. They found thousands of artillery pieces, oiled and ready to fire. They found 190 miles of tunnel stocked with millions of rounds of ammunition. They found a subterranean industrial complex that was still manufacturing weapons. Imamura's farming strategy had worked. His men were healthy, they were fed, and they were waiting. An Australian commander, looking at the defenses, reportedly turned to an American officer and said, Thank God we didn't try to take this place. If the Allies had followed the traditional rules of warfare, if they had let ego dictate their strategy and attempted to conquer Rabaul by force in 1943, the cost would have been unimaginable. Post-war analysis suggests that an invasion of Rabaul would have resulted in over 30,000 Allied dead and perhaps 100,000 wounded. It would have consumed the entire U.S. Pacific Fleet for 6 months. It would have delayed the end of the war by a year. Instead, the casualties for taking Rabaul were zero. This was the genius of the leapfrog strategy. It was the ultimate embodiment of Sun Tzu's ancient maxim: the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. The Americans had denied the Japanese the one thing they craved most: a battle. The Japanese soldier was prepared to die for the emperor, to throw himself onto a grenade, to charge a machine gun. But he was not prepared to be ignored. By bypassing Rabaul, the United States turned Japan's greatest asset into its greatest liability. Those 100,000 men were removed from the war board just as effectively as if they had been killed. But on September 6, 1945, nearly a month after the atomic bombs fell on Japan, a small launch cut through the waters of Simpson Harbor in Rabaul. It carried General Hitoshi Imamura, the commander of the Japanese 8th Area Army. He was heading towards the British aircraft carrier HMS Glory to formally surrender. As Imamura climbed onto the flight deck, the Allied officers waiting for him expected to see a broken man leading a broken army. They had seen the starving, skeletal survivors of other battles like Guadalcanal and Buna. They assumed Rabaul was a graveyard of disease and despair. What they found instead shocked them to their core. General Imamura stood tall. His uniform was pressed.